Hello, my name is Sarah Jane Melancon, and I'm a junior. This semester, I decided to do my research on donkeys, and I decided I wanted to do research on donkeys because I work with donkeys in a therapeutic setting, and I really didn't know a lot about donkeys. So I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to learn more about the donkey's role in donkey-assisted therapy. But before I could do this, I really decided that I needed to address what I call the donkey problem. And the donkey problem, as I define it, is a lack of research about donkeys in the donkey body of research generally. So I decided this needed to be addressed before I could really get into some of those other questions that I had about donkeys and donkey-assisted therapy. So I did a review of donkey history and research as it relates to their use in donkey-assisted therapy. So I just conducted my research through the lens of donkey-assisted therapy. Now, I want to preface my presentation with, I presented my presentation at an international conference hosted by the University of Exeter, and I was connected with, it's located in the UK, and I was connected with a lot of people who are actively involved in the research about donkeys and are heavily involved in the field of donkey-assisted therapy. It's a lot more common in Europe than it is in the United States. And what I found is that there's a lot more research out there than I was able to find, but I still think it's worth highlighting all of this information because the average person is not going to be able to have access to all of the information about donkeys. And so even though there is some more research out there, and not everything I found is the most comprehensive, it's what I could find as a college student with a considerable amount of research, more than the average person. So I still think it's worth discussing. So to give you an idea of what exactly I did and why it matters, I'm going to read my thesis statement because I think it sums that up really nicely. Despite playing an important role in human history, considerations for the donkey as an independent being are lacking in current research, ultimately serving as a detriment to donkey welfare. In recent years, donkey-assisted therapy has become increasingly popular, and in order to ensure that donkey-assisted therapy is ethical for both the donkeys and humans involved, the gaps in current research must be analyzed and addressed in future research. So how I went about this was I gathered articles from all of Carroll's databases and Google Scholar. And I did some pretty extensive searching, and my professors helped me out with this. And they are well-versed in research. And at the end of the day, I used 16 articles in my actual research, but I considered a lot, and my criteria for including the research was that it's the most recent and the most representative of that area of research. Now, had I had the resources that I acquired after the fact, I think this would have looked a lot different and my outcomes would have looked a lot different, but I think the broad conclusions would be the same. So keep that in mind. The first area of research that I looked at, and really one of the most informative about what we know about donkeys today, is the history of the donkey. Donkeys were first domesticated in ancient Egypt, and they were actually pretty highly revered. Archaeologists have found their skeletons in close proximity to pharaohs, so that means they're a big deal. But what they were revered for was their ability to work really hard and not eat a lot of food. So they were very much still used and abused even when they were revered. And donkeys, the skeletons that archaeologists found in Egypt were pretty extensively damaged. Their joints were compressed and their bones had damage, which showed damage that aligned with being overloaded with weight and overworking. So even when they were revered, they were abused, and early in human history, specifically evidenced in Greek literature, donkeys started to develop a reputation for being stubborn, lazy, self-willed, stupid. The list can go on. And these characters, it's important to understand that these characteristics are stereotypes that came out of comparing donkeys to horses. And this is one of the overarching issues. Donkeys throughout history and today are constantly compared to horses, and so the expectations for donkeys are often wildly unrealistic because donkeys have a different number of chromosomes than horses and a very different evolutionary history that accounts for a lot of the behavioral differences that account for these stereotypes. So what I looked at first after I dug into the history was what we know about general donkey care. And granted, what is out there is actually more than what I found, but this is what is accessible broadly to not even the average person, the average undergrad college student. I found a couple of articles, not very many, and essentially what we know about donkeys are general guidelines on how to properly care for them that have been derived from horses. And this is problematic again because they're different species, different evolutionary history. Their metabolisms are a lot slower because they evolved in a desert climate, and so they have a different digestive coefficient. So simply converting horse scales over to donkeys is not enough. And I was informed that there actually are specific guidelines for donkeys after the fact, but even after the fact, I had a lot of trouble finding the resources, and a lot of the information that I was pointed to is not actually published, or at least not published in a way that I was able to find evidence of. So that's a problem in and of itself. This information is not accessible. The next area that I looked at was donkeys and donkey-assisted therapy. What we know now, what we have, what information we currently have. So I looked at 3 articles, 2 from Italy, 1 from the UK. The first was a literature review, and it came out of Italy. It compared the research that we have about donkey-assisted therapy and equine-assisted therapy. Essentially, it stated that equine-assisted therapy has the research body to back it up, but donkey-assisted therapy doesn't. So until we have that information, we should not be using donkeys for donkey-assisted therapy. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we stop using donkeys for this purpose altogether, but it can't be claimed as therapy because it's not a clinically proven modality. And this poses a danger to the human and to the horses, and claiming it as therapy is dishonest. The next thing that I looked at, study that I looked at, was a pilot study, and it just looked at the effects of children with disabilities and donkey-assisted therapy, and it had a lot of really great positive indications that donkey-assisted therapy is effective, but we can't make any broad statements about its effect on general populations because there wasn't a big enough sample size. And finally, I looked at a thesis from Michelle Witham-Jones out of the University of Exeter, and she's really who pointed me to all of the research, and she's actively involved in creating research. She pointed me to some research that she has not published yet. And her thesis was about donkey-assisted therapy for children with autism, and she looked at both how it affected the children with autism and how it affected the donkeys. And she really has tried to be an advocate for donkeys, but even in her resources, she didn't have a lot of donkey-specific research that she cited, and to me that was kind of problematic. And I think it's a really great starting point, but I don't think we're fully there in being able to prove, even though you can't really prove anything, but just show that donkey-assisted therapy is a effective treatment modality. So the final area of research that I looked at were the ethical considerations. And for this section, I looked at 5 studies and found some overarching themes that are really important moving forward. So first, scientists have stated a need to dismantle the stereotypes that exist about donkeys so that we can overcome these barriers to their care and really create a more solid foundation of research. The second was a need to consider both the physical and emotional health of the donkeys. And this is very closely tied with fitness for the job, but essentially we need to make sure that these donkeys are safe to do this work, both for their own safety and the safety of the humans involved. You wouldn't expect every single human to be able to conduct therapy or to be fit for that job, just like we shouldn't expect donkeys to be able to do this, all donkeys to be able to do this job. Now, they're not therapists, but they're engaging in some pretty intense emotional labor. And this is a taxing job for them. At the end of the day, it's a job, and we need to be considering this and making sure that there are scales in place so that we can measure these things adequately and ensure that donkeys are happy, healthy, and safe. So this brings me to my discussion and conclusion. And I think that this stands regardless of the information that I did not have access to throughout the project. The first thing is that labels are dangerous. The labels that donkeys have carried throughout their entire domestication essentially have impacted their welfare in a negative way. And this can be said for any species. And I think it's important that we as humans really start to acknowledge that and take it to heart. Second, going along with this, donkeys are sentient beings and they haven't always been treated as such. And it really does impact the research that we have on donkeys today. And so it's important moving forward. And finally, donkey-assisted therapy has the potential to be validated. I think it won't be long before it is validated. But I am not confident that we're there yet, and I think more work needs to be done before it's ethical to call it donkey-assisted therapy. And finally, this leads me into what I'm left with and what I really think is the whole point of this research project, and that is donkeys are incredibly useful to us and have been throughout human history. So it's time we ask, how can we be useful to them? I think as a species who have benefited from them, we owe it to them, especially since we continue to use them for human gain. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have a great day.